A Nigerian lawmaker has an invitation for Kanye West. Come visit a slave port. Senator Shehu Sani is tweeting the rapper is defecating on the graves of victims. Sani is joining a chorus of outrage over Kanye's appearance on TMZ when he implied slavery was a choice.
400 years? For 400 years? That sounds like a choice. Like, you was there for 400 years and it's all of y'all? You know, like, it's like we're mentally in prison. I like the word prison because slavery goes too direct to the idea of blacks. It's like slavery, Holocaust Jews, slavery is blacks. So prison is something that unites us as one race, blacks and whites being one race. That we're the human race. Do you feel that I'm feeling? Do you feel that I'm being free and I'm thinking free?
I actually don't think you're thinking anything. I think what you're doing right now is actually the absence of thought. And the reason why I feel like that
is because Kanye, you're entitled to your opinion. You're entitled to believe whatever you want. But there is fact and real world, real life consequence behind everything that you just said. And while you are making music and being an artist and living the life that you've earned by being a genius, the rest of us in society have to deal with these threats to our lives. We have to deal with the marginalization that has come from the 400 years of slavery that you said for our people was a choice. Frankly, I'm disappointed, I'm appalled, and brother, I am unbelievably hurt by the fact that you have morphed into something, to me, that's not real.
Now, Kanye may have seemed a bit off the rails, but he's not the only one who's missing some facts. Jamie Warren is a professor of American history at the City University of New York. I talked with her earlier about how a lack of education about the era contributes to misconceptions about enslaved people. Jamie, you heard Kanye West's statement about 400 years of slavery, and he says, it sounds like that's a choice to me. As an Americanist, someone who studies this, what was your first reaction to that?
My first reaction is it's not the first time that I've heard something like this, but at the same time, it always stops me in my tracks and just kind of leaves me aghast, like jaw dropped in horror that somebody would have this reaction that, yes, 400 years of slavery, and yet it's not 400 years of making a choice. It's the fact that it lasted for 400 years only points to how coercive and violent the institution was. It speaks nothing of the people that were enslaved. It tells us a lot about the nature of the people who were enslaving them.
And it's interesting you say that this is not the first time you've heard this. So he is not the only one that has this view.
Right.
Who's pushing this view?
I mean, he might be the only one who has stated it so, you know, nakedly, and I go so far as to say, you know, stupidly, but also I hear it in much more subtle forms, even coming from maybe a more innocent or even benevolent place from even my students in the classroom who ask simply, why didn't slaves resist more? And so it's sort of embedded within that question, I do hear a bit of a curiosity. Was there some sort of compliance with slavery from the enslaved? And my response to this question is usually, there was a lot of resistance, and we know what happened in the forms, whether it was daily resistance, individual resistance, or collective resistance, the Stoner Rebellion, Nat Turner, the absolute, swift, violent destruction of those who partook in the resistance. And then what I also tell my students is that there's probably so much history of resistance that we'll never know because these folks don't get a chance to leave records behind. And in particular, those who resisted were probably those who were killed the most swiftly. And so they have even less of a chance to reach the historical record.
One of the things that's always striking to me about American history is that slaves in particular, it was illegal to educate them,
right,
illegal to give them the tools of literacy that would allow them to organize. What other ways were indicative that this system that lasted 400 years was not a choice?
I think we have to look, again, and it's important that we don't focus on the enslaved making a choice. We have to, the other ways we know this is indicative it's not a choice is how many laws were passed to enforce even those white people who did not own slaves to partake in the policing of slavery. So for example, at certain points in the Carolinas in the colonial period, on Sundays, all white men had to carry guns. They had to carry guns legally because there was a fear that if there would be a slave insurrection, it would happen on Sunday when people are at church. So men are carrying, you know, there's many laws like this that forced poor whites to partake in the policing of enslaved people. And so this reminds us that there was a constant fear of slave insurrections going on. In one of my personal researches, I found a woman's diary, and she had nailed her door shut at night when her husband was away. And this just points to the constant white fear of black resistance and black uprising, because she was afraid for her own life, which tells us the whites that were living there at the time that were bearing witness to slavery absolutely were certain that their slaves were not choosing to remain where they were.
In fact, not only were they not choosing, but there was always talk of a possible rebellion.
Right.
You mentioned that all these white men in this one city were carrying guns on a Sunday because of the threat posed by a possible rebellion. When we look at the white side of it, these are poor people who did not own slaves.
Right.
They were not getting rich from this. In fact, one could argue that they were also being kept down by this system as well. In what other ways? Because it's important to dispel this myth that this was a choice.
Right.
In what other way is it clear that slavery was not a choice?
If we look at the response to slave rebellion and the amount of violence that was enacted by the whites against blacks who did rebel, we become quite aware that there was a need not only to smash any particular rebellion, but to send a message to anyone who might consider rebelling.
Hence
so, for example,
the
lynchings, decapitations. So during the Stono Rebellion, the slaves who managed to flee their plantations had almost made it to Florida before they were caught. Those who had organized the slave uprising were decapitated. Their heads were posted on stakes, allowed to rot in public as a constant reminder of what might happen to those who did try to resist. Even more, one form of slave resistance, it's a debated form of slave resistance, was suicide. Some folks who actually chose not to be enslaved by choosing not to live. But according to some African cosmologies in the 16 and 1700s, there was a belief that if the body was somehow desecrated after death, the soul would remain in place where the body was. And so one form of punishment against suicide, to try to pressure other slaves to stay alive and stay enslaved, was to desecrate the corpse of those who committed suicide. So there was really no way out.
There was no way out. Are students learning enough about American slavery so that this does not happen? Because it's not enough to know facts.
Right.
You're talking about connections between reality.
Right. One of the things I think is problematic about the way, first, the answer is no, they're not learning enough about slavery, and they're not learning how constitutive it was of all parts of American life, economic, political, social, religious. But one other thing that I think folks don't think about as often is that when slavery does enter the curriculum, particularly in high school, it tends to enter the curriculum in terms of freedom. So we tend to teach the Underground Railroad, or we tend to teach Frederick Douglass's autobiography. We tend to teach stories of slavery when they result in someone becoming free. Actually, I think it's the majority of slavery curriculum in high schools focuses on the Underground Railroad, which affected a tiny minority of people. We don't teach slavery in terms of slavery. We connect it back to the narrative of American freedom over and over again. And I think that is an overwhelming problem.
Because it implies that everyone had this choice to leave and the willingness to risk everything.
Exactly. And it reaffirms the narrative that America's always been about freedom, that there's always this path out, path up, when simply that wasn't the case for most people.
Do you think comments like Kanye's are irresponsible?
Deeply irresponsible. Deeply irresponsible. I think that they give intellectual weaponry to those who are seeking to make sense of, justify, accept current black oppression.
Thank you very much for your insight.
Thank you.
It's about students who are doing it right and a lady they love. Michelle Obama is continuing a tradition she started during her husband's administration. National Signing Day is an event designed to encourage high school graduates to go on to college. At the Easter celebration in Philadelphia, Mrs. Obama told students they need to disregard doubters who might stand in their way.
Oh my, I'm not one of those doubters. I know you have everything it takes to succeed. I know that you are me. And if I can be standing here as your forever First Lady, then you can do anything you put your mind to. So remember this moment when you're out there, when you hit those roadblocks. Remember all these people who were thinking about you and praying for you.
Now that message was reinforced by a lot of star power. Nick Cannon, Sierra, Robert De Niro, and a host of other entertainers thrilled the crowd. And thank you so much for watching Arise America in New York. I'm Duarte Geraldino. We'll see you right here next week. Have a good one.